The snow fell in heavy, relentless sheets, blanketing the open prairie in a silence so deep it made the world feel unreal. The wind whipped across the barren hills like a wild animal, carrying with it the bitter taste of frost and the lonely cries of distant coyotes. In the midst of this frozen expanse, a lone cabin stood, a squat, weathered structure of rough-hewn logs, its roof sagging under the weight of winter's wrath. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, carrying the faint promise of warmth and human life. Rancher Thomas McCall trudged through the deep snow, his coat pulled tight against the biting wind. His boots sank into the powder with every step, and each breath came out in clouds of mist. Beside him, a lanky shepherd dog padded silently, ears flat, eyes scanning the empty horizon. Thomas had spent years on this land, alone but for his animals, his only company the wind and the sky. The harshness of the West had shaped him, taught him patience, endurance, and the quiet strength needed to survive. But nothing in his years of solitude had prepared him for what he was about to find. He spotted movement ahead, faint at first, just a shadow against the white. Squinting, he realized it was a small figure, hunched and trembling, stumbling through the snow. As he approached, the figure became clear, a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, her cheeks red from cold, eyes wide and filled with terror. She clutched a tattered shawl around her shoulders, and something about the way she looked at him made Thomas pause. "Hey there," he called gently, lowering his rifle. "You all right, little one?" The girl's eyes flicked to him, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice that barely rose above the whistling wind, she asked, "Can you save my mommy instead of me?" Thomas froze, the words striking him harder than any bullet ever could. He knelt in the snow, keeping his voice steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "What happened? Where's your mama?" The girl shook her head violently, tears streaking the dirt on her face. She's hurt. I don't know. She can't walk. She's in the cabin. Please." Thomas's gaze darted toward the tree line. Through the falling snow, he could just make out the dark outline of another cabin, smaller, almost hidden among the bare pines. He rose slowly. "All right," he said, his voice low but firm. "Show me where." The girl nodded, barely speaking now, and turned, her small legs sinking into the snow as she led him. Thomas followed, his dog at his heels, ears twitching at every crack of ice or rustle of branch. The wind tore at their faces, but he ignored it. He had seen death and suffering before, and he had learned that hesitation could kill. When they reached the cabin, the scene inside made Thomas's stomach tighten. A woman lay on the floor, pale and shivering, a deep gash across her leg soaked in blood. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle. The little girl knelt beside her, pressing a hand against the wound with all the strength her small frame could muster. Thomas dropped to his knees beside them, untying his coat to use as padding. "Stay with me, ma'am," he said. "I'll get you through this." The little girl's eyes met his again, wide and pleading. "Please, save her. Don't let her die." He said nothing, just nodded. He moved swiftly, tying a tourniquet with his belt, examining the wound. "You're strong," he said to the woman. "Hold on. We're getting through this." The dog nuzzled the little girl's shoulder, sensing her fear. She leaned into him, a fragile smile breaking through her worry. Thomas caught it in the corner of his eye, and it gave him a surge of determination. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the frozen cabin. Thomas worked tirelessly, cleaning and dressing the wound, using what little medical supplies he had. Outside, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, rattling the thin walls. The little girl stayed close to her mother, whispering words of encouragement, her small hand pressed against the woman's cheek. By the time the first hint of dawn brushed the horizon, painting the sky in soft pink and orange, the woman's breathing had steadied, though she was still weak. She opened her eyes slowly, confusion and recognition battling in her gaze. "Thomas," she croaked. He nodded, a small smile breaking through his stern, weathered face. "Yeah, it's all right. You're safe now." The little girl let out a relieved sob, wrapping herself around her mother as she sat up. "You saved her," she whispered, clinging tightly. "You saved my mommy." Thomas didn't answer. He simply helped them to their feet, guiding them toward the warmth of his own cabin. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving a sparkling frozen landscape that seemed almost peaceful after the chaos of the night. He glanced at the little girl, who now walked beside her mother, and realized that in this harsh, unforgiving land, family was not always born, it was chosen. As they reached the cabin, he opened the door and let them in, shaking snow from his coat. The fire was low, but it crackled back to life with Thomas's kindling, casting a soft glow over the three of them. He fetched blankets, wrapping them around the woman and the girl, who clung to each other as though they would never let go. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse but full of gratitude. "I don't know how we'd have made it without you." Thomas shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. You're not out of the woods. We've got a long road ahead." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside the cabin, for the first time in a long while, there was warmth. Not just from the fire, but from the bond forming between a lone rancher and a small family in need. The little girl looked up at him, eyes wide, as though asking something unspoken. He gave a small nod in response, silently promising that he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. In that moment, Thomas McCall understood something he hadn't before. Survival was not just about enduring the storm, it was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And in the frozen silence of the snowy west, he had found a family worth fighting for. The wind outside continued to howl, but in the cabin, there was a fragile, budding sense of hope. And as the fire warmed their frozen bodies, Thomas knew that whatever hardships awaited them in the bitter winter, they would face it together. The storm outside hadn't relented. In fact, it seemed to grow fiercer as the morning dragged on, whipping the plains into a swirling blur of white. The cabin creaked under the weight of the snow, and Thomas could hear the soft hiss of ice forming along the roofline. Inside, the woman's condition had worsened. The tourniquet and bandages had bought them time, but Thomas knew it wasn't enough. Infection could set in, and without proper care, she might not make it through the day. The little girl, whose name he had finally learned was Lila, stayed glued to her mother's side. Her small hands never left the wound, and every so often she whispered something that Thomas couldn't catch, words meant only for the woman who had saved her from the freezing night. The bond between them was immediate, fierce, unbreakable, a protective instinct that Thomas both admired and feared. "I need to fetch more supplies," Thomas said finally, breaking the heavy silence. He tried to keep his voice steady, though the icy wind outside pressed against the walls like a living thing. "Stay here. Keep her warm." Lila's gaze snapped to him, wide and terrified. "No. Don't leave us." Thomas crouched to her level. "I won't be gone long. I just need something to make your mommy better. You understand?" She nodded reluctantly, her little jaw set. "Be careful," she whispered, as if the cold itself could reach him through the door. Bundling himself in every layer he had, Thomas stepped back into the blinding white world outside. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind tore through him with every step. He followed the barely there tracks of his own morning trek to a nearby trading post, a place he had once relied on but hadn't visited in months due to the isolation of the prairie. He knew it would be treacherous. The path was long, and the storm offered no mercy, but Thomas McCall had faced worse. Hours passed in a blur of cold, pain, and relentless snow. Thomas's boots were soaked, his fingers numb, and every breath burned his lungs. But the thought of Lila and her mother, waiting for him, kept him moving. Survival was never about himself anymore. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "Can you save my mommy instead of me?" At last, the trading post emerged from the storm like a ghost, snow-laden and silent. Thomas pushed open the door, stepping into the warm glow of the cabin-like store. The bell above the door jingled, faint against the roar outside. He quickly gathered what he could: bandages, disinfectants, pain relievers, anything to stabilize the woman until the storm passed. Then came the hardest part: returning. The snow had thickened, turning familiar trails into a white maze. The wind had shifted, carrying with it an eerie howl that made Thomas's heart pound. Wolves, or worse, could be out there. He knew that in this wilderness, predators took advantage of anything weak or exposed. But he refused to let fear dictate his steps. He had a promise to keep. Back at the cabin, Lila had grown restless. She had tried to keep her mother warm, stacking blankets and whispering encouragement, but it was clear she was tiring. The woman's breathing had slowed, shallow and ragged, and her skin had taken on a grayish hue. Thomas's heart clenched as he entered, laden with supplies. "Thomas!" Lila cried, rushing to him. "You're back. Did you get it?" He nodded, kneeling beside the woman. "We're going to fix this, okay? You're not going anywhere." He worked quickly, cleaning and dressing the wound with careful precision. The woman flinched, groaning softly, but Thomas kept talking to her, keeping his voice steady and calm. "You're safe. We'll get through this. Lila's here, I'm here, and we're not leaving you." Hours passed, and the storm raged on outside. Thomas made the woman as comfortable as possible, layering blankets and ensuring she stayed warm. Lila stayed at her mother's side, eyes full of fear and determination. Thomas caught himself watching the girl. She was small, but there was a courage in her he hadn't expected. She had survived the cold night, the terror of her mother's injury, and the unforgiving wilderness. She had survived, and in some strange way, she reminded him of why he had stayed in this desolate land all these years. Not for the quiet, not for the solitude, but for moments like this. The wind finally began to ease as night fell, though the cold remained, deep and biting. Thomas built a fire, tending it carefully while Lila sat close to her mother, rubbing her small hands against the woman's cheek, murmuring words Thomas could not hear. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the flames and the shallow, ragged breaths of the injured woman. "Thomas," the woman said hoarsely, opening her eyes for the first time in hours. I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head, tired but unyielding. "No thanks needed. Just rest. You've been through enough." Lila leaned back against her mother, a small smile breaking through the fatigue and fear. "He's our family now," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Thomas didn't answer. Words were useless in this moment. Family wasn't something you could explain. It was something you defended, protected, and sometimes something you chose. And tonight, in the frozen heart of the West, Thomas had chosen. Morning came slow, with the sun barely peeking over the horizon. Snow still clung to every surface, sparkling like shards of glass in the pale light. Thomas watched as the woman stirred, her breathing steadier, her eyes clearer. Lila was still by her side, though her small frame trembled with exhaustion. "You saved her," the woman whispered again, her voice stronger now. "You saved us both." Thomas finally allowed himself a small nod, but his mind was already on the next steps. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Supplies were low, and the storm could return at any moment. They would need to move to survive, and he would need to protect them both from the dangers of the West: wolves, frostbite, and human threats alike. For the first time, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on his shoulders. It was heavier than any pack of cattle, more demanding than any storm, but he welcomed it. He had found a purpose beyond solitude, a reason to endure, to fight, to live. And in the little girl's eyes, he saw hope, a fragile, shining hope that even in the coldest, harshest winter, family could be forged. The wind outside whispered over the plains, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, resilience, and a sense of something unbreakable forming. Thomas McCall knew that the road ahead would be long, and the dangers many, but he would face them. For the woman, for Lila, for the family he had chosen to protect. The days that followed were a test of endurance, courage, and raw survival. The storm had passed, leaving a frozen wasteland in its wake. Snow drifts towered against the cabin walls, and the plains stretched endlessly, glinting under the harsh winter sun. Thomas had spent every waking hour tending to the woman and Lila, ensuring they had warmth, food, and hope. But he knew their respite was temporary. The West was unforgiving, and winter spared no one. The woman, whose name was Clara, slowly regained strength, though the gash on her leg left a lingering limp and a grim reminder of how close they had come to losing her. Lila had taken it upon herself to help, running small errands, stacking firewood, and keeping her mother company. Her spirit, resilient and unwavering, became the glue that held them together. Thomas watched them closely, often catching himself smiling at their small gestures, Lila brushing her mother's hair back, Clara giving the girl a tired but tender smile. One evening, A distant howl cut through the frozen silence. Thomas stiffened, instinctively moving toward the door with his rifle in hand. The dog growled low in his throat, ears pricked. "Easy," Thomas murmured, though his body was tense. Wolves. Predators that stalked the open prairie in winter, drawn to any sign of weakness. He scanned the horizon. The snow made the landscape a ghostly white canvas, but he could make out dark shapes moving with a predator's purpose. Clara and Lila huddled closer to the fire. Thomas's gaze softened briefly at the sight of them, the firelight dancing across their faces, before he hardened again. "Stay inside," he instructed. "Don't come near the door until I say so." The wolves were cunning, circling the cabin, sniffing the air, testing the walls of their small haven. Thomas knew they wouldn't attack recklessly, but hunger and desperation could make them bold. He checked his supplies. A few rounds of ammunition, the dog, his wits, and a rifle that had seen more battles than he cared to count. It would have to be enough. Hours passed. The wolves stayed on the outskirts, their glowing eyes reflected in the snow. Thomas watched, alert and patient. Lila clutched her mother's hand, whispering words Thomas couldn't hear, but the courage in her voice cut through the tension. He realized that while he was the protector, the girl had a bravery of her own, a spark that refused to be extinguished, even by the cold or fear. Finally, the wolves retreated, slinking away into the forest, leaving the cabin in an uneasy quiet. Thomas exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders in slow, heavy waves. He allowed himself a brief glance at Lila. "You were brave," he said softly, and she smiled faintly, her cheeks pink from the cold and excitement. But survival was more than fending off wolves. Supplies were dwindling, and the frozen plains offered little in the way of game. Thomas knew he had to move, to seek a safer place for them until spring thawed the land. Clara's leg, though healing, was still weak, and the journey would be difficult. But there was no choice. The prairie was merciless, and the storm's aftereffects could be as deadly as the storm itself. The next morning, Thomas packed what little provisions they had, layering blankets and securing them to his horse. Lila helped, tying small bundles of food and supplies, her hands red and chapped from the cold. Clara, leaning on Thomas's strong arm, took slow, careful steps, her trust in him absolute. "I don't know how we'd have made it without you," she murmured, voice soft but steady. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. "You're stronger than you think. We'll get through this." The journey across the snow-covered plains was grueling. Thomas led the horse, guiding Clara and Lila carefully over drifts and icy patches. The wind cut at their faces, stealing warmth and sapping strength. The dog ran alongside, sometimes darting ahead, sniffing the path, always returning to keep close to his human family. As night fell, the cold deepened. They found shelter in a natural depression among rocks, a small windbreak against the biting air. Thomas built a fire, careful to keep it low but warm enough to fend off frostbite. Lila clutched Clara's hand, exhausted but determined. Thomas sat nearby, scanning the horizon, every sense alert for danger. He realized that this was more than survival. It was a lesson in trust, resilience, and the unspoken bond of family forged in adversity. Several days into the trek, Clara stumbled, her leg giving out on the ice. Thomas caught her immediately, his hands steady, his eyes fierce. "Hold on," he said firmly, lifting her onto the horse. Lila climbed on behind, wrapping her small arms around her mother, clinging like a lifeline. Thomas led the horse carefully, one foot in the snow at a time, aware that a single misstep could spell disaster. Finally, they reached a small settlement, an isolated outpost of log cabins where other ranchers and settlers had taken refuge from the harsh winter. Thomas guided them to the nearest cabin, securing them inside. The warmth and the sight of other people stirred a sense of relief he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. Clara collapsed onto a bed, exhausted but alive, while Lila nestled close, finally allowing herself to rest. Thomas stepped back, surveying the scene. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "You saved us," she said, her voice small but certain. "You saved my mommy and me." He knelt to her level, brushing a strand of snow-damp hair from her face. "We saved each other," he said quietly. "And we're going to keep doing that, no matter what comes next. In the following weeks, Thomas remained with them, helping Clara regain her strength, hunting and fetching supplies, teaching Lila about the land, the animals, and the ways of survival. The storm had forged a bond stronger than blood, a family born from choice, courage, and the harsh beauty of the West. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the snow-covered hills, casting a golden glow across the settlement, Lila sat on the porch with Thomas, watching the wind play across the frozen fields. "Do you think we'll always be together?" she asked softly. Thomas smiled, a rare warmth softening his weathered features. "As long as I'm breathing," he said. "Family, that's what we are now." Clara, standing nearby, nodded in agreement, her eyes full of gratitude and quiet strength. They had survived the storm, the wolves, the endless cold, and the near loss that had threatened to tear them apart. And in doing so, they had discovered something stronger than fear or hardship, the bond of chosen family, tested in the crucible of winter and proven unbreakable. As night fell and the first stars appeared in the cold, clear sky, Thomas felt a rare peace settle over him. The wind still whispered across the prairie, relentless and wild, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, safety, and the quiet assurance that they would face whatever came next, together. For in the freezing expanse of the Old West, where life was as harsh and unforgiving as the snow-laden plains, Thomas McCall had found something worth everything: a family, a home, and a promise kept. And as Lila rested against her mother, the little girl's words from that first night echoed in his mind. "Can you save my mommy instead of me?" Thomas had said nothing then, but his actions had spoken louder than any words. He had taken both, and in doing so, had gained a family that would endure long after the snow melted and the prairie bloomed once more. The wind outside howled its endless song, but inside, there was a warmth that no winter could touch, a testament to courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond of chosen family in the wild, unforgiving West.